Good morning, everybody. It is good to see you. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us from home. And I do want to remind anyone in the room, 5th grade or younger. If you're 5th grade or lower than that, you can make your way to the auditorium lobby. And we have leaders there who are ready to escort you to a program designed for you today that we're just getting started back up. And we're very grateful to be able to do that. Last week, Marnie launched us into a new series of messages on the leadership of Nehemiah. And I want to repeat again. She said this last week, but I think it can't really be said often enough. This is a book written by an individual who was not a priest. He is not a prophet. He is not a pastor. He's not really ordained in any way. I have a friend that said to me that Nehemiah is the one book of the Bible that was written by a general contractor. And that really is true. We could think of him in a number of ways. At the very least, we might say Nehemiah is an executive. Now, if you had a Bible open in front of you today, which is always a great idea, if you have one, go ahead and open it to Nehemiah. But I'd love for you to take a moment, flip back to the left, just a page, and you will see the book of Ezra. At one point in the development of the canon, Ezra and Nehemiah were really regarded as a unit, almost like one book, Ezra and Nehemiah. Because even though there's a little bit of difference in the timing in Jerusalem, these two people were essentially co-workers together. Ezra was the priest. Ezra is the teacher of the law, and his primary work within Jerusalem is to call people back into this covenant relationship with God. He is calling the people again to faithfulness, to attentiveness to God's word and obedience to God's law. Nehemiah is the project manager. He is the executive. He's the government official, and his primary work in Jerusalem is to rebuild the walls. And together, God used them in a very important work. I want to kind of get started today with a little pop quiz. Okay, it's 2 questions long. It's not very long, and that's the good news. The bad news is if you miss one question, you get a 50. It's not a good grade, all right? But how many of you recognize this focused image from a piece of artwork? How many of you recognize that? You can raise your hand, don't be bashful. Okay, that's like most of you. Kind of expected that. Now, question number 2. Do you know where it's from? Anybody want to speak up? Yes, almost in unison. The Sistine Chapel. This structure was completed in the year 1481. In the year 1980, the Vatican undertook a project, and it was not the first time it had been done, but they undertook in 1980 a project to clean and restore the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel. What I found interesting about this was that project took 14 years, from 1980 to 1994. A team of experts worked carefully, deliberately, painstakingly to restore brightness back to these images in the Sistine Chapel. By comparison, the 14-year restoration project, it only took Michelangelo 9 years to paint them. It says something about the significance of the work of restoration. We're calling our series this month, Rebuild. But it's really the idea. I want to say to you, if there's one word about the book of Nehemiah that I'd want you to hang on to, the story of Nehemiah is a story of restoration. And that is so important in the larger scope of the Bible, because the entire story of the Bible, friends, and don't miss this, from Genesis chapter 3, where God's good, perfect, beautiful creation is reduced to ruins. From that moment on, the rest of the Bible is a story of restoration. God is at work to restore, all the way to Revelation 22, where we are told there will be no more crying, no more pain, no more death, no more illness, no more hunger. He will wipe every tear. That's where things are headed. God is in the business of restoration. I heard someone say on a podcast yesterday, I thought this was so helpful. You may be sitting here today and there's something that you're really unsettled about, because truthfully, none of us know the future. You don't know the future, but you know the end. And the end is restored. Nehemiah is a book of restoration, and at this point in the biblical story, God is at work through Nehemiah to restore the walls of Jerusalem and to restore his people into fellowship with himself. Now, to give you just a little bit of context again, okay, we're going to do a little bit of timeline for just a few minutes. Can you hang with me? Are we good? Okay, let's take a look here. The situation in Jerusalem goes all the way back to 587 years before Jesus shows up on the scene. 587 BC, the Babylonian Empire laid siege to and destroyed Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed, the walls are destroyed, the gates are burned with fire, as we hear in Nehemiah. Now you come forward a little bit. The people then were carried away as captives into exile. But about 537 BC, the exiles begin to return to Jerusalem. They come over years and they come in waves, but it begins around 537 BC. But for the longest period of time, things do not go well. In fact, the temple is not rebuilt or restored until 516. It took them a long time even to begin rebuilding the temple. We come even closer, and Ezra returns to Jerusalem in 458. And then we pick up the story where Marnie had us last week in Nehemiah chapter 1, when Nehemiah asks specifically about the exiles who had returned. And then he gets this burden. His heart is burdened for this restorative work to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And he goes back to do that in 445 BC. God is on a mission to restore and rebuild. He was on that mission to do that in the city of Jerusalem. He is still in that work today. He wants to do that around us. This is our calling as a church, and not just Grace Church. Every congregation this morning, every congregation worshiping in the Lehigh Valley, we exist to be a part of God's restorative work in this world. We pick up the story today in Nehemiah chapter 2. So again, if you've got a Bible, I would encourage you to open it or look at your phone, or we're going to put it up here on the screens, and you can follow along that way. Nehemiah chapter 2, we're kind of jumping in the middle of the chapter at verse 11. I went to Jerusalem. That little phrase covers a lot of time. We're going to come back to that. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. That's what Marnie was talking about last week, that burden, what God had put in my heart. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble that we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. Nehemiah's task is to restore and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. The city is in ruins. The walls are a shambles. The gates have been burned with fire. Nehemiah had learned back in chapter 1, the report was that the people are in trouble and disgrace. And those two words show up again in chapter 2, trouble and disgrace. And so Nehemiah is now on a task to get back, to restore. And as we go through this series, I do want to ask you to think, is there anything around you? Is there something that you see, or is there something within your own life that you would describe as trouble and disgrace? I want you to break that word down. Disgrace, no grace. Ungraced. Degraced. Where are those places? God is at work to restore. And as we look at this text, as we just follow what Nehemiah did, we see a little bit of a path, if you will. A path toward restoration and how he enters into it. And I want to walk with you through the story that we heard and just get you to observe a few of these things with me. First of all, Nehemiah moves, but he is not in a hurry. Move, but don't rush. You know, the reputation that Nehemiah has when we think about him is that he is a decisive leader, and he is. He is decisive, but he is not hurried. He's not anxious. He's not trying to force something. In fact, last week, the prayer that Marnie had us look at in Nehemiah chapter 1, and he learns of the condition of Jerusalem, and the first thing he does, he wept. He sat down and wept and prayed. And you can read that prayer in less than 2 minutes. But in the next chapter, where he goes to the king with a plan, we can tell from chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 1, there has been a period of 4 months. Not 4 weeks, not 4 days, not 4 hours, 4 months. The prayer that you and I can read in less than 2 minutes, Nehemiah prays month after month after month, thinking, reflecting, talking to God, wrestling with. He is not pushing. And even when he comes to the king, he presents the king with a need, and he has a plan. The king says to him, what do you want to do? How long will you be gone? What do you need? Nehemiah gathers that together. But to make the trip from the capital of Persia, the winter capital, by the way, Susa, all the way to Jerusalem was a distance of roughly 900 miles. Some Old Testament scholars think that that trip probably took Nehemiah another 4 months. One commentator speculated, I don't know how we arrived at this, but that he said very likely Nehemiah and his entourage, they probably traveled at the rate of 9 miles a day. Think about that. A 900-mile trip. Yes, Nehemiah is decisive. He moves, he acts, but he does not hurry. You know, I don't have any trouble. I don't think I've really ever had an issue believing in God. I think very often I've had an issue with God's timing. Why is God so slow to act? And in Nehemiah, we see him, he's not rushing ahead. He's not pushing or forcing. He is walking with the God who is in the business of restoration. Friends, my encouragement to you is simply this: move, but don't rush. We're not to be passive. We're not to be settled in our resignation to the brokenness around us. We are called to act, but to walk with God. Do not rush ahead of him. The second thing Nehemiah shows us, he defines reality, but he does not despair. I love this part of the story. Nehemiah simply says, I went to Jerusalem. Okay. I went to Jerusalem. Yeah, like 4 months he went. 9 miles a day he went. But then he got there. He waits another 3 days. We're not told why or what. Maybe he just needed to rest. Okay? 3 days. But then he says, I went out by night with just a few people. He went out by night, and the word shows up twice in the text, examining. Some Bibles use the word inspecting. And he lists the order of what he saw: the valley gate, the jackal well, the dung gate. It's exactly what it says it is, people. Use your imaginations. The king's pool. Then he gets to a point where he says it sounds like he really couldn't go much further. He had to get down off of his mount. And then he retraces his steps back to the valley gate. He takes an honest look at exactly where they are and what they're dealing with. And then it's interesting what he says to those who were with him. He says, "You see the trouble that we are in." Jerusalem lies in ruins, and the gates have been burned with fire. All I want you to hear in this little verse is how direct and truthful it is. There is no denial in Nehemiah. There is no dressing things up. He simply defines reality, but he does not despair. That's one of the people who truly have a leadership gift. This is one of the things I admire about really effective leaders, is that they're optimistic. They just have a confidence in what they are called to do. Nehemiah defines reality, but he does not despair. I love this simple statement from a book called Leadership is an Art by Max Dupree. The first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. To simply say, here's what it is. Here's where we are. Define reality, but don't despair. Have you ever taken on a job like maybe around your house? And it sounded like a good idea in your head, and then you looked at it, and you were like, oh, wow. And usually what we do is we procrastinate. We're like, I'll do it later. You ever tried to, what, are you going to clear out your basement? Oh, man. Define reality, but don't be discouraged. Yeah, there's plenty around us that is broken, that is disgraced, but we don't despair. And that really leads immediately to what Nehemiah does next. He invites, invitation before instruction. There's a little moment in the story that's so important, because if you and I were to skip over to chapter 3, all that chapter is, and I got to tell you, it's not very exciting to read. It's simply a list of name after name after name and where they were assigned to build the wall. So-and-so went here to build. So-and-so was here, and they built here, and these folks built here. It goes on and on and on. But before Nehemiah instructs and assigns and directs, he invites. He says to the people who were with him, come, let's rebuild the walls. He wants them to get to see and to share that vision of restorative work. He's basically saying to them, come on, we can do this. We can do this. And we need to hear that too. We need to hear that invitation. When we look at the world around us and when we look at the Lehigh Valley, friends, we can do this. And I'm not talking about just building a building. I'm talking about restoring and being a part of what God is doing in this community. We can be a part of that. Nehemiah brings others into it. It can't just be his idea. And he knows that. Invitation. The burden he carries, he shares. And others carry it with him. There's no other way to do it. I don't know, maybe you're carrying a burden. I don't know if it's a burden for something else or just a burden, but you are not meant to carry your burdens by yourself. So as we step back at this point, here's a way to think about the Nehemiah story. Here's what we see so far. He learns of Jerusalem. He sat down and wept. He spoke up. He shared it with the king. He set out. He went to Jerusalem, 900 miles. He looked around. He defined reality. He looked at the truth of what was there, and he called together people to be a part of God's restorative work. He sat down. He spoke up. He set out. He looked around. He called together. Can you say that with me? He sat down. He spoke up. That is the Nehemiah story as of today. It's where we are. God is on a restorative mission in this world. And today we're going to come to the table, to the bread and the cup. And every time we do that, we are reminded of God's greatest restorative act, how he moved. He came to us because we were in such a condition, maybe a condition of disgrace, an absence of grace. We were in trouble. Something in your life could be in ruins. And God never says to us, he never says to you, figure it out. He doesn't just tell you to figure it out. He came to us in Jesus. And through his death and resurrection, his broken body and his shed blood, we are restored. And because that's true, we join God in his work of restoration. Would you join me as we prepare ourselves to come to the table this morning?